Also, in a survey last year, asked farmers what they thought about the export tax, whether they thought it had a negative effect on them. And 77% of the cocoa farmers never even heard of the export tax. So it wasn't something that was featuring prominently in the way the farmers were understanding developments in the sector. This, I guess, it presents the data slightly differently. This presents the two periods and then the percentage of international price being received by the farmers. Again, showing this fact that somewhat surprisingly, the price being received was higher after the tax was implemented. It seems, there's a couple of reasons how we can explain this, what otherwise might be an anomaly based on economic theory. And this shows that there's been a change in the nature of the value chain, and so the marketing structure. Whereas before the tax, very few farmers were selling directly to exporters. Whereas after the tax, I should say exporter here, I should change that, it's a bit inaccurate. It can also be a large domestic processor. So I guess who are sort of one of the big grinding firms here, or one of the raw bean exporters. So there's been a change in these study areas towards direct relationships, direct buying programs. Okay, so in conclusion then, the tax has encouraged investment in the cocoa processing sector, and so has probably led actually to significant overcapacity. Most of this investment has been FDI. The study did not show any noticeable downward impact, and in fact it seems to have showed an increase in farm gate prices, so those concerns that the tax would affect production levels in Indonesia seem unfounded, and any reduction in cocoa production that might have occurred, it's difficult to relate that directly to the export tax if we assume that the mechanism there is decreased farm profitability and farmers moving elsewhere. There's no real reason we could use that as an explanation. How can we explain that? This is where it comes a little bit back to theory, and that is that the econometrics can tell us so much if we assume that the markets are operating efficiently. However, in this case, what we're seeing is it's the nature of the value chain itself which determines, perhaps more than anything, where value is being allocated amongst different actors. So because of the export tax, a greater role for domestic processors who are then developing direct relationships with farmers, where they weren't doing that in the past. Other factors such as, here actually, the increased role of sustainability schemes and certification programs, which also require the big players to start working directly with farmers. So these changes in the structure of the value chain and the way the value chain is being governed have probably had a greater effect, or have had a greater effect on the farm gate price rather than what would be assumed out of economic theory. Through that, we're seeing that probably the profits of the middlemen and the local exporters have probably diminished. So there's been a loser here. It seems to have been the big cocoa trading companies who aren't grinding. And a lot of them anecdotally seem to be closing up shop now across Indonesia. And there also might be effect on middlemen. And I'm always a little bit conflicted what to think about that. I know sometimes we hear a lot that the middlemen are extracting excess profits along the supply chain, so that if we can cut out the middlemen, that will be better for farmers. I also think, well, there's also people losing their jobs, even though they're middlemen or traders. What that means in terms of welfare, I think is an open question. Although my general feeling is, if you're a trader of any size at all, then you're probably quite reasonably capitalised, and you're probably able to reallocate that capital and resources to other profitable business ventures. So I think in terms of a net impact on welfare, I don't think that the cutting out of the middleman or the traders is going to have a major impact in terms of poverty and welfare. So I guess the last point there is that the two main changes, one was the fact that domestic processors set up a local buying arrangement, and the second was this growth of certification schemes and sustainability, which were changing the structure of the value chain. So the key implications there, I guess these assumptions about the functioning of perfect markets tend to underestimate the significant effect that value chain structures can have on prices and price transmissions. and then in turn the value chain structures are shaped by various non-market influences, including government policy in this case, and also social and environmental considerations of consumers and others in the value chain. Now what this means for policy in Indonesia, I'm not sure how much we can extrapolate out from this to say that maybe we should be adopting protection of domestic industry and RBI across the board in Indonesia, because there's not going to be an effect on producer prices. I'd be very concerned over drawing that out, but I think it's going to depend more on the specific structures of the value chain in each place. So this showed that the direct impacts of this particular RBA policy on poverty alleviation are probably not as negative as otherwise predicted by theory. But again, we need to understand the specifics of the value chain to really estimate what it might mean for poverty and welfare. So hopefully I've left a lot of time for discussion. I mean, that was the key finding there, which for me as a researcher was quite satisfying, because it was actually proving something that I assumed would happen was not the case, and then prompted us. And I should say, this is a paper which is still, I think, did we end up sharing the draft there?
Yeah, we have the draft.
Yeah, which is okay. So it's written together. I should have probably acknowledged the meaning at the beginning as well. Different co-authors on the paper: Fauzia Kartika from BPTP in Makassar, and also Alexander Meakin from the University of Sydney. So we're also looking then to develop this now into a paper. So I'm also looking as well for any sorts of feedback or discussion as we move the paper ahead, also towards publication. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. So I will open immediately the discussion for the public. So any question? If you can identify yourself for the speaker and raise your question.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm Arvind, the World Bank here. Just a quick, maybe just a few slides back, there was this, the slide about production, what's happened with the exports of processed and unprocessed. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So to me it seems like a bit of a puzzle that at the farm level, when you're interviewing farmers, it doesn't seem to be much of an impact in terms of prices, and also when one of the things you're saying is like many of them haven't heard of the tax itself, but at the level of the exports, there is a significant volume impact, because you can see the volumes are falling, and the value has fallen as well of exports, quite a lot. So you can see, so what does that mean? I mean, one, that's a puzzle for me, because you can probably point to smuggling in some ways, and so then the welfare impact here has to sort of take into account that, because that's lost revenue, that's also the ability of policy to deal, for a government to deal with cocoa policy, because now you've created this parallel networks that you're encouraging that. So that was a puzzle. So maybe if you had some more qualitative evidence, that would be great.
Sure. No. The same thing obviously occurred to me. Yeah, the same issue of course occurred to me. I mean, first of all, the decrease in value, and I probably didn't point this out before, this is cocoa prices on the right here. So part of the fact that the loss in value is the fact that cocoa prices over that period had actually declined somewhat from an earlier peak. So that sort of explains to a degree the loss in value. Now the smuggling, I tried to look into this by looking at trade data into Malaysia. And so, of course, the big impact of restriction of Indonesian cocoa beans in the world market was the impacts that would have on the Malaysian processing sector, because that's where most of them had been going prior to the tax. Because I was also assuming that smuggling would have been playing a major factor. Now, over that same period, and it's hard to say here, but according to UN Comtrade data, Malaysia simply replaced and substituted Indonesian cocoa beans for West African beans. So there was actually a noticeable increase in the imports there from Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire in particular. I'm not sure. I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence or anecdotal support for the idea that smuggling has increased, and therefore, if that's the case, then we wouldn't expect to see any impact at the farm gate. The degree to which that's happened, though, I haven't got any strong evidence for that. And so the scale of it's very difficult to tell. And so the trade data suggested that perhaps it wasn't as great influence as I assumed it might be. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes, next please.
Hello, my name is Zaki Fakbi from World Bank. I also happen to follow the development of the farm gate price for the cocoa for our study on Sulawesi development diagnostic. And we found the same observation as you are in the BPS data. If you are using the household data in the BPS data on the farm gate level, also showing that after export tax, actually the percentage of price compared to the world price is actually increasing. And it also, there is the IFC study in 2010, which also showed the same, even though the conclusion of that study saying that the farm gate price have a negative effect on the farm gate price of the farmers. My question is, I have a question for you. Your explanation of the relative increase of the farm gate price to the world price ratio is because of the change in the value chain structure. I would wonder whether it has also something to do with the global situation in the cocoa production. I read from ICCO that cocoa now is entering the so-called structural deficit period, production deficit up to 2000 something, where the quantity produced is much less than demand. That's the increasing demand because of the increasing middle class in Asia, but the production is going down because of the pest, because of a lot of things in producing areas, including in Sulawesi, which explain and that also explain the decrease in the production in Malaysia after in the 80s. So my question is, does that play the role? And then the implication probably on the industrial policy, maybe the cocoa is a if you want to pick the winners, this is the sector which is appropriate because of the global situation, which is not going to have an adverse effect on the farmers. My second question concerning you mentioned about the welfare effect of the to the middleman. Probably I don't know, middleman is also apart from I think the cocoa in the cocoa sector, many of the middlemen are not major middlemen. So, and from what I read from the literature, middlemen, there is some kind of rural non-farm employment for those living in the village who absorb the surplus from the farm sectors, and they are getting employment in the trading sectors, and that opportunity are losing now. But we haven't got any analysis or any figures whether the welfare effect for the middleman is adverse or not. But maybe you could give like some insight on whether the effect is going to be positive overall, or it is a losing opportunity for like the losing rural non-farm economic opportunity for the rural villagers.
Sure. So, well, I mean, the second point first, maybe on the middleman. So I'm really not sure about that one. I don't know where I stand, to be honest. I guess it is possible that it's a loss of rural non-farm employment, and that might be a negative thing. I don't know. I don't have any empirical evidence for what it means in terms of welfare or any research on that. But again, I guess I come back to the assumption that those people do have, however, I mean, when I see middlemen here, this can be local tengkulak sort of collectors at the farm gate, all the way up to big regional traders and even exporters who have lost out. Now, even at that small level, I think you're still looking at actors that are somewhat capitalised, and that, assuming that the markets are working relatively well, they can probably reallocate that elsewhere. That's my assumption. And that's based on just observations of the individuals involved. They could probably reallocate that to other agricultural commodities they might be working in, or even to other small business development opportunities. So I don't have any clear evidence on that one, although I think it's a fascinating question, because it often, I don't know, when a number of seminars, it always comes up. So we need to cut the value chain, and there's all these assumptions, of course, that the tengkulak are having a negative effect, and they're exploiting farmers, which I think are all rather narrow, naive sort of views of the role played by collectors in the first place. But I'm not sure what the welfare effects would be of losing that out, of them losing out. In terms of the role of the world supply dynamics, I mean, of course, if the scenario you pointed there is true, of declining world production and increasing supply, then that would presumably be reflected in prices. However, so we go back to these, where is it? So I mean, prices fluctuate, and it so happened that over this, in the two sites, they're about the same level. So if we could explain that increase as being an increase in global prices, then we wouldn't have seen this. So I don't think we can look at the increased share as reflecting international developments in terms of supply and demand, specifically as it operates through prices. However, and here's I think a key point, there are concerns over the long-term supply of cocoa. So at the moment we're not actually seeing declining production worldwide, we're still seeing increased production levels. However, there are quite genuine concerns over cocoa supply in another 10, 15 years and where that's going to come from. So those longer-term or medium-term concerns are affecting the activities of lead firms in the sector. And so we're seeing particularly the big chocolate manufacturers getting more and more involved in what they refer to as sustainability programs at the farm gate. So they're sort of starting to set up their own supply chains, working together with farmers, maybe using certification schemes. So these mid-term concerns are being reflected not in price level directly, but in the changed structure of the value chain, and they're moving upstream, and that may be leading to an increase in the share. So does that make sense? I think it's drawing out a distinction there between supply and demand dynamics operating through prices to explain this, which is not happening because of this data here, but potentially happening because of the changed value chain, because companies are changing their corporate strategy to reflect their long-term concerns. Does that sort of answer? Yeah.
But probably also the change in the structure also driven by the world market situation, which leads the exporters to play. For example, they are buying a country buying station more because they are chasing more goods.
Yeah. I should say actually, just on that topic, there's a lot of discussion, I mean, in the cocoa sector about this supply crunch. So this idea that, you know, in the popular press as well, we see articles like chocolate is going to cost the same as its weight in gold, or the chocolate lovers of the future are going to be losing out supply. All these sort of quite hyperbolic, extremist statements about world cocoa supply. I must admit that I don't buy that so much. I tend to have a bit more faith in the role of markets here, and that if there really is a supply problem, then prices would increase, and that a lot of farmers who aren't investing much of their own time and resources in cocoa production now would probably reallocate some of their labour towards that, which would then address at least partly that supply question. So in some ways I think it's not so much a long-term crisis of cocoa supply, but maybe a crisis of cheap cocoa for the chocolate manufacturers, and that's why they're investing upstream.
Other questions?
Jeff, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. I got two very quick questions. The first one is with regard to the fluctuation in farm gate price. I mean, obviously you've taken a number of things into consideration, including fluctuation in the global price, as well as some of the quality as well. I think you used moisture level as an indicator. I'm just wondering if there are other components of quality that might affect that as well. I mean, I'm just thinking perhaps more like certification. If there has been an increase in certified cocoa beans, we would probably hope that that would be reflected in a higher farm gate price, whether or not in the ideal perfect market that increase in price would have been reflected a bit more. And then the second question is probably something that's a bit broader. I mean, we're talking about developmental implications. Farm gate price is obviously a key indicator, but I was also very interested when you mentioned about the change in the governance structure, whether there is anything else that's observed other than the disappearance, if you like, of the traders and middlemen, whether we have seen, because this is something that's kind of common across different industries. You tend to see that as the value chain develop, you tend to see the middlemen, if you like, disappearing. You might see consolidation of the lead firms or the global buyers at that level, whether we see that disappearance of the local grinders as well, for example. The relationship, now that they're selling more directly to local exporters, either exporters, you say, or grinders, whether it's the same transaction still done on spot, or we see any information of more contract farming, for example, and things like that, and whether selling directly to the processors now that they're having their own direct investment, whether that give the farmers, if you like, better protection towards fluctuation in the world price. Yeah, I don't know whether all those things are also in your research. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot in there. Yeah, we did use moisture as a key quality indicator. There are a number of indicators. We could potentially use bean count, so how many beans per 100 grams. So that sort of reflects the size of the beans and therefore the effect of the amount of waste. It was just too difficult to collect that sort of data at the farm gate specifically. Although you would expect, as you said, through certification perhaps, probably more the direct buying. The direct buying activities would lead to an increase in quality as well, which may well have led to the increase in farm gate price. That is a possibility. How much that matters, I suppose that matters in terms of if that improved quality also had an increased labour demand, and so therefore they had to spend more time sorting cocoa beans, and that might be reduced profit potentially. But I guess the assumption there is that if the prices increase, whether it's through quality, and that sort of reflects an increase in income. Or that there's an assumption there, obviously, that needs to be tested. Should also say that this is also based on the assumption that farm gate prices do reflect global prices, okay, and that they are being transmitted to the farm gate. And most the few publications that have been, that are out there looking at that in Indonesia does suggest actually that farm gate prices do reflect fairly accurately what's going on at the global level. So that's what that assumption is based on work being published elsewhere. In terms of the changed relationship between the lead firms and farmers compared to traditional networks, I think there's one really interesting or potential implication that's not looked at, and that's the role of finance in the chain. And so, this traditional role of a tengkulak collector who would often provide finance before the harvest and would then maybe get back that finance in terms of a reduced price, and that is usually looked at as being an exploitative relationship in terms of a downward pressure on farm gate prices. It's also a really important source of finance. I think most people would also recognise that when you're in an environment where there's very little access to banks, that these Tengkulak are playing a really important role in terms of providing finance. So I know some research I've looked into in Africa has suggested that actually direct buying schemes can have a negative effect because you end up destroying that access to finance role that's being performed by Tengkulak. I think that's a potential, I guess, to take place here, because a lot of the larger companies aren't in a position to be able to monitor that finance the same way that a Tengkulak is. Tengkulak is there in the village as well, probably social ties as well with the community, is therefore able to monitor the harvest in a way that a large company just isn't able to. And so therefore the company is going to be a lot less willing to engage in providing credit, and that's certainly been borne out as well by empirical observations as well. So that I haven't necessarily seen that in the cocoa sector, but I can imagine, I could envisage that being an unintended consequence of the direct buying programs. Perhaps on a little bit of an aside to that as well, in terms of unintended consequences, if there's a direct buying program, particularly ones that are related to certification, and that means that to have a certified product, such as cocoa, you normally have a cooperative of some sort that comes together and that sort of pulls the cocoa together, and then that sells on to the large buyer. Now, traditionally, particularly in the Bugis areas of South Sulawesi, it was normally the women's role in the family to market their product. So sort of traditionally the men would be more responsible for the on-farm production, and the women would be responsible for selling the cocoa beans. Now, as a result of the certification programs, what we've seen there is that need for a cooperative, that need for an organisation for certification, it starts becoming a political structure. And the political structure often becomes dominated by men. And so as a result of certification, it seems actually the traditional role of women in marketing their product had decreased. And this is a separate study where we're looking at the effects of certification. And so again, you could potentially unintended consequence of a direct buying program could be a decreased financial role for women within the household. A bit of a slight aside, but in terms of the general theme of the unintended consequences of the program.
Thanks, Jim. My question about who gets what from the policy. When we're talking about the agri policy, one side you said that we have some, let's say, positive, negative, but from the macroeconomic perspective, have you identified some, let's say, for example, how many rupiah the government gets from the export tax? Just very rough idea. And how many, the extension, the capacity of the manufacturing for manufacturing. So we can compare at the level, we can prove that this policy at national level, we do have added our value, added something like that. More, capacity extension, and we can also gain export tax, something like that. So we can compare from, let's say, when we're talking about who gets what, any indications that the money spread to the farmers or local people. Why it happens for the case for the fiscal policy, where the government, they give kind of incentive to the farmers for the tobacco, but wrong policy it seems to be. That maybe you can identify such issues.
Okay, there's two parts maybe to that. One is the revenue question. I mean, if you're looking at exports of 400,000 tonnes at, we'll say, for argument's sake, $2 tonnes, about $800 million. 10% of that, anyone do that? Was that 80 million? I don't think the revenue. I mean, you look at the Indonesian fiscal, but it's not that important. I wouldn't have thought in terms of revenue generation. The other part of that as well, of course, is that where is it? If the policy is successful, in the sense that it's encouraged industrializations, then over time exports of beans will decrease, and therefore so will the revenue. So you would expect that the key, and I could be wrong here, but that was not a main driver for the policy. It was in terms of revenue generation, because it's minimal in terms of total value and contribution to the fiscal position, and also if successful, then it's hardly sustainable, because over time it would probably disappear. In fact, that's exactly what's happened now, because the actual volumes have decreased so much. But in terms of who gets what and who benefits, I mean, quite clearly that domestic processors benefit enormously by cheaper cocoa beans, and according to my study, farmers are also benefiting indirectly through changes to the value chain structure that were at least partly caused by the export tax as well. Who loses? We'll say it seems to be the middlemen and the traders who seem to be losing out in terms of the actors along the chain.
I forget to introduce my name. I'm Nuzlakia from UI. Forget. Jeff is my old college. Thanks.
More questions? We have time, so please. I will ask.
I will ask one question. Do you have any idea if you would like to look as an outcome at quantity produced, right? Because ultimately, I think one measure of the success of the policy will be an increase of the quantity produced from, let's say, nationally, okay, versus, let's say, purely export-led production. Let's say domestic-oriented production versus export-led production, right? So you expect at some point this substitution to happen, right? And this to generate, let's say, positive spillover in terms of apart from production, but also like from employment generation. I think, if I understand correctly, that's the overall kind of aim of the policy, like to kind of stimulate more domestic production. Can you observe, or do you have any idea about to which extent whether you can decompose, let's say, the effect of the policy on quantity and disentangle it from the effect of fluctuation in international prices?
You're talking about the domestic farm level production of cocoa beans.
Exactly.
Yeah. Should say that's a sort of a fairly hotly contested issue in the Indonesian cocoa sector. What's exactly happening to production over the last 5 years? A key thing that happened along with the export tax was also a large government program, the GERNAS program, the Gerakan Nasional, for the revitalization of cocoa, which a lot of money, I think it was something along the lines of $2 billion was spent in an attempt to increase production. Official production figures have tended to suggest an increase. However, I think most industry observers would say that it's very difficult to reconcile that with what they're seeing in terms of trade data. I mean, where is the cocoa going? It seems to be actually that production levels are decreasing over the last 4 or 5 years since the tax, and I haven't got the data there, but they certainly look at the ICCO, the International Cocoa Organisation, and their estimates for Indonesian cocoa production, which is again showing a decrease. How that could be affected by the cocoa tax, I mean, the only way that I could see how it would be affected would be if there is a relationship between the tax and farm gate prices, then there would be a disincentive if there is a lowered farm gate price. I can't see any other mechanism where there'd be a direct relationship between the export tax and farm level production if it's not through the price mechanism. So therefore, if we say there's no effect on prices, we should be able to say therefore there's no causal relationship between the tax and the levels of production going on within Indonesia. I think that you'd probably say production levels are being affected by various other factors. I mentioned pest and disease being a key one, as well as potentially the negative effects of other large programs in the sector and sort of the distribution of inferior planting material. In terms of employment, I mean, I guess the assumption here is increased industrialization will also generate employment. And so that if there's more cocoa processing, there might be more urban employment being generated. It is possible in the long term, but I think you need to remember that cocoa processing is hardly a labour-intensive activity. It's essentially a capital-intensive activity, and it's not going to be anywhere near the sorts of employment generation that the farm-level cocoa production would be.
Okay. Any more questions?
Thank you. My name is Lutfa Ariana. I come from Center for Science and Technology Development Studies from Indonesian Institute of Sciences. I just have one question. Maybe it's a little bit beyond of this context, but still related. Did you also identify about the innovation activities that has been generated by the local farmers? So it could generate the value chain, higher value chain of the product.
Inflation?
Innovation.
Innovation, oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that the real aim of this policy was not so much about value adding at the farm level. That most of, the cocoa value chain there, where the first step is cocoa grinding, to make cocoa butter and cocoa powder. So this is a very highly capital-intensive, high-technology sort of economic activity, and that cannot really take place at the farm level beyond a very, very rudimentary, basic way, which would never be able to be sold into international markets at the moment, that level of technology. So I'm aware of a few activities that have been promoted through, I think, maybe the Ministry of Industry or maybe the Ministry of Cooperatives to try to encourage farm-level processing and manufacturing of chocolate, which I think with variable success. I think sometimes maybe in terms of penetration into local markets, that might be possible. Is that what you're referring to? Is it the idea of farm-level manufacturing of chocolate products?
I meant maybe farmers have some technology transfer from outside that can be used for increasing the value chain, the value added of the products.
Okay. Well, what has been a very interesting development, which is associated with the restructured value chain and the role of the large companies working directly with farmers, is that farmers in the past have had very unreliable access to extension services, so in terms of agronomic technologies, about pest management, for example. Now that role is increasingly now being performed by the large chocolate companies. That you'll see big international chocolate companies like Mars, who are setting up their own cocoa academy in rural parts of Sulawesi, which is like a cocoa research institute, and therefore they're using that as a mechanism to provide new technology, particularly in terms of farming activities to farmers. So there's been a major shift there in terms of the way that knowledge and technology is shared amongst value chain actors, and the trend there is towards the role for the private sector in disseminating knowledge and replacing the role that was traditionally performed by government. We often tend to think of agricultural extension as being the domain of governments, as being a public good that governments should provide. In the cocoa sector and a number of other sectors as well, we're seeing that role being performed by private companies instead.
Thank you. More questions?
Shall I add another one? So you mentioned first the examples of Malaysia. Do you have any example of other countries where actually tax policies like this have been effective or have worked? Maybe if not just in cocoa industry or in similar industries.
Well, Brazil has been very successful.
I was thinking about
in the cocoa sector, coffee as well, they've been sort of a major mover in terms of developing of instant coffee products. In fact, the story goes that Nescafe was developed because of oversupply in Brazil, and a way to sort of assist the way of using up the excess supply coming there. So I think there's been a number of examples where taxation policy has been, and whether it's successful or not, I think that's sort of still to be played out. Success, whether it has led to industrial or growth in the industrial sector, yes. I think the question then becomes what that means for maybe net welfare.
Yeah. And it was the same type of tax, it was like an export tax.
In Brazil, I think they've used export taxes before to industrialise. I think the question, Malaysia is an interesting example there, where if in Malaysia the sector industrialises and then production crashes, what are the net effects of poverty rates there? And well, in Malaysia, an example, there seem to be enough alternative employment opportunities there that those farmers were able to seek employment elsewhere. So the big question is, at what stage of the agrarian transition is Indonesia at the moment, and how much can farmers easily transition to non-agricultural work, or be able to produce other commodities instead of cocoa? Cocoa is a very pro-poor crop. To grow cocoa, you really need access to land, very little capital. You can get planting material quite cheaply. And within 18 months, you've got good planting material, you can already get a return back. So with very little startup capital, you can get income. You compare that to palm oil, for example. Palm oil, one, you need access to a greater land, but you also need capital. It takes longer to mature, greater set of inputs, and so therefore, so in Malaysia, again, the cocoa sector was largely replaced by the palm oil sector, and I think that reflected the changing relationship between capital and labour in Malaysia, where there was more capital available out there, and so therefore that was replacing labour in the rural landscape. Now, the extent to which that's happening in Indonesia, I think is going to gain, depending on that relationship as well. I think that probably to say that the situation of the rural poor in Indonesia is such, there's still a lot of Indonesian farmers that don't have access to capital and could quite easily transition to a crop such as palm oil. I think we're not quite there yet.
I have one more question. Now, can I ask you what is your overall assessment of whether this export tax policy is successful or not? Because if you are talking to, for example, some policymaker, they see the shifting in the export structure toward more process as a successful indicators. Would you say that that should be the indicator of success, or something else?
Yeah. No, I wouldn't. That's why I did this study. So for me, the indicator of success has to be combined with the effects it has on farmers as well. So from my perspective, I wouldn't be happy with a policy outcome that improved the exports of processed products and assisted industrialists in Jakarta and Tangerang and Surabaya if that happened at the expense of farmer welfare. However, which is why I did the study. However, I would say that if these results are accurate enough, and I should say there's one other study that's also used a similar approach, but not collecting farm gate price, but collecting the prices at buyer stations, which also came to the same conclusion. So therefore, I would say a combination of increased industrialisation, increased investment, along with a restructured value chain leading to higher farm gate prices as a percentage of the global price as being a success. So I guess that would be my response. I'd like to see the two indicators there. I wouldn't be happy with just increasing industrialisation as an indicator. And so therefore, that's something to say this is necessarily going to be effective across all commodities. So I don't want to say that therefore I'm advocating this should be to all export, to all raw material products from Indonesia, this would have similar results. I don't think it necessarily would. I think your comments earlier on about the global supply situation are an important factor that led to these superior outcomes in the cocoa sector. The question is how much of these, cocoa supply has been increasing. The land at the end of the day is finite. You can't keep cutting down forests and planting cocoa forever. At some point that land is going to run out. And of course that's true for a number of different commodities, agricultural commodities as well. So to the extent to which improved productivity and new technology can make up for any supply constraints across the board. It's obviously it's a highly debated issue as is it's related with food security as well. But I think if we assume that there are these finite constraints on resources and that commodity prices are likely to increase in the future, which is again a hotly debated set of assumptions there, then you would say that this policy towards resource-based industrialisation could be an effective strategy for Indonesia in the long term.
One question.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Chen, and I'm with AmCham Indonesia. At AmCham, we often look at the business environment for companies to come in and do a lot of these, industrial policies that the government wants. And I was just curious if the companies that you mentioned in this study who had built processing plants, if they had access to some sort of government incentives or similar schemes like that.
As far as I'm aware, no. The primary policy lever here was the export tax, and that was sufficient to stimulate investment. I should say the next stage of the research was to look at this across a number of different sectors, and I think that's where the new industry law that's been passed here, and as that gets sort of filtered through into government regulations, whether there'll be more specific tax subsidies or other sorts of policy levers there to encourage investment. But as far as this sector was concerned, it seemed that the primary lever was the export tax alone. So the Ministry of Trade moving ahead with it. Unless someone else in the room knows more about the investment restrictions around the sector. As far as I'm aware, there was no other sort of form of tax subsidy or anything.
Other questions? Yes.
Very quick questions, less comment, I guess. I guess the one thing that's also worth looking at is the newly approved new trade bill earlier this year. It will be very closely linked to the new industry bill, and that would be the policy instrument, I guess, the government would be planning to use, because it specifically say it includes provision for the government to actually use import or export restriction, including export restriction when it comes to raw materials to ensure input supply, and then obviously with different implications across the different sectors. I think that's probably one thing that's worth looking at as well. And I guess with this, I was just the one thing I want to ask you is on the plan now to actually remove the import tax on cocoa beans. I mean, you mentioned that just now. There has been some opposition from some farming representatives, and I guess this is quite dramatic in a way, because the government on the one hand want to enhance processing in the cocoa sector, and then allowing some of those excess capacity to be used will actually help the processors achieve, scale efficiency. But at the same time, whether that will then dampen the long-term growth opportunity in the farming sectors, I think that's something that's very delicate and difficult to balance. Do you have any view on this?
I'd probably come back to the comparison with Malaysia again there. Mm-hmm. Sort of where Malaysia sort of allowed the industry to develop at the same time as allowing imports, and that seemed to work well for the processing sector. It may have happened at the expense of the farm sector. That was all right because there are alternatives. I guess the question to ask is whether there are alternatives or not in rural Indonesia where cocoa is being grown. I'm not sure. It depends where you stand, I suppose. I mean, if Indonesia becomes an importer of beans and exporter of processed products, it gets integrated into the value chain in a slightly different way, and that may then lead to long-term benefits, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, I often wonder if the voice of the farmers in this, of course, is very difficult because there's no clear Indonesian Cocoa Farmers Association that actually gives a voice to their concerns anyway, and are able to lobby. And in fact, they were totally absent from the lobbying that went on around the export tax as well. I'm not sure it would be that great a threat, to be honest. Allowing import of beans, I'm not sure that would necessarily result in a crash of prices. I mean, there's enough concerns out there over supply that it probably wouldn't have that bigger impact. Could be proven wrong though.
Other questions? Okay, I think if there are no other questions, I would like to thank Jeff for the very interesting seminar, and thank you all for the discussion. So, thank you, Jeff.